Spiritual awakening doesn't always illuminate. Sometimes it destroys everything you thought motivated you. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths that's rarely mentioned. We've been taught to view awakening as a glorious goal, as if it were all about peace, clarity, and instant purpose. However, the reality is that this process can be brutal, sweeping away all the structures that previously gave meaning to your life. That instant when the light enters is also the moment when many of your old certainties die, and with them, the motivation that sustained your day-to-day life. Most people who undergo a profound awakening face a paradox. They believe that discovering the truth would fill them with energy and clarity, but instead, they feel apathy, emptiness, and even disorientation. And here the big question arises: why does this happen? Why, when the soul opens to mystery, does life lose its color? This is one of the great contradictions that few explain and that Carl Jung clearly understood. Lack of motivation is not a mistake along the path. It is part of the transformation itself, a sign that the old self is dying to make way for something new. Jung maintained that awakening involves confronting the shadow, everything we have repressed, ignored, or disguised within ourselves. When this encounter occurs, the soul is laid bare before its own truth. And in that instant, many of the reasons that previously motivated us lose meaning. Superficial goals, social recognition, material attachments, even the most mundane desires crumble in the face of the depth of this confrontation. Motivation fades not because something is wrong, but because the soul no longer wants to chase illusions. It seeks a different force, a more authentic driving force, even if at first it is experienced only as a great emptiness. That emptiness can feel terrifying. You may wake up every morning with no reason to continue your routine, without the spark that once seemed to guide your steps. And yet, this apparent inner desert is a purification. Jung described it as the disintegration of the ego, a painful but necessary process where everything that isn't real in you begins to fall away. Motivation dies because it needs to be reborn from a deeper place, a place that doesn't depend on masks or lies. And although at first this may seem like a curse, it's actually the prelude to a new birth of the spirit. I want you to know something. If right now you feel like your motivation is dead, you are not broken, nor have you failed. On the contrary, it means you have been touched by the mystery of awakening and that your soul is entering a process much greater than your mind can comprehend. This disorientation is not the end. It is the first sign that your life is being redirected toward a higher purpose. The first shock of spiritual awakening comes like an inner earthquake. Suddenly, everything you had trusted crumbles. The social, religious, or personal illusions that once gave you security no longer hold water. It's as if a veil were torn before your eyes, and you saw that many of the goals you pursued were simply projections imposed by society. Success, money, external validation, titles, or achievements no longer have the luster that once made them so desirable. What seemed like motivation yesterday is now perceived as a chain. The awakened soul discovers that it has been living in a mirror structure where most of its motivations were foreign. You wanted to achieve goals to please others, to be accepted, to feel worthy. But at the moment of awakening, those reasons fall away like empty masks. What once drove your life is revealed to be fragile and insufficient, and a deep feeling of disillusionment is immediately born. This is where many feel they die inside, because the external fuel that kept them going no longer ignites them. Carl Jung said that awakening is a process of radical disillusionment, because the first thing it destroys is the lie. And that lie isn't outside, but within ourselves. We realize that our search for social recognition, religious approval, or material possessions was merely an attempt to fill a much larger existential void. When we see this clearly, what once seemed important loses all meaning. And then the shock occurs. External motivation no longer has power, but internal motivation has not yet been born. That emptiness, that space of transition, can be devastating. Many people become depressed because they feel like nothing is worthwhile, that nothing makes sense. What's happening is that the soul is rejecting the superficial, but it hasn't yet found its true self. Address. And this is where spiritual awakening becomes a test. Can you withstand the collapse of the old without losing yourself in the abyss? This collision with hidden truth is not a punishment, but an opportunity to shed all layers of deception and begin to live from the purest authenticity. The external world will continue to pressure you, trying to convince you to go back to chasing money, success, or approval. But if you listen carefully, there will be a deeper voice within you reminding you that this path is no longer yours. You are being called to discover a different motivation, a strength that comes from the spirit and not the ego. And although this process may be painful, it is the first sign that awakening has begun to take root in your life. When you undergo a spiritual awakening, one of the first inevitable experiences is the symbolic death of the ego. The ego is that mental construct that tells you who you are, what you've accomplished, and what supposedly gives you value. Throughout your life, motivation was fueled by this ego. Achieving success, recognition, affection, or power were the fuel that moved you forward. But the moment the ego begins to weaken, that fuel disappears, and what remains is a deep, bewildering, and often terrifying emptiness. This emptiness isn't a coincidence, nor is it a mistake. It's the space that opens when your former identity begins to crumble. The person you thought you were, the one who accumulated titles, victories, and comparisons, no longer sustains your existence. And this is where many feel completely lost. The ego has largely died, but the new self has yet to be born. It's a middle ground, a spiritual desert where the direction and motivation that once seemed so clear are lost. Carl Jung expressed it with a powerful phrase: "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making darkness conscious." And precisely in this process, that darkness manifests itself with force. There is no longer artificial light to deceive you, no longer illusions to sustain you. Only you remain, facing the depths of your being, where what once seemed solid is revealed to be emptiness. It is an encounter with nothingness, with that inner silence that seems to devour everything. And although it may seem like an experience of loss, it is actually an opportunity to recognize who you are beyond the ego. This state is known as the dark night of the soul, a passage where the ego fades away, and what remains is apparent meaninglessness. Many abandon the path at this point because they mistake this emptiness for failure, failing to understand that it is precisely the necessary test to shed all that is false. In emptiness, the mind no longer has control. In emptiness, the soul begins to search for another source of life, a motivation that depends not on human recognition, but on a deeper spiritual truth. Ego death hurts because it strips us of what we identified with, what seemed to sustain our existence. But it's also liberating. It opens the space for authenticity to be born. If today you feel unmotivated, lacking energy, as if everything you were has disappeared, remember this: you are not losing anything real. You're leaving behind a mask. The inner emptiness is not the end. It is the prelude to your true awakening. When the ego weakens and external life loses strength, a difficult-to-describe sensation appears: the weariness of the soul. It's not a physical or emotional tiredness, but a deep fatigue that envelops every aspect of existence. It's waking up in the morning and feeling that simply continuing weighs too heavily. It's looking at the days and routines with a burden that wasn't there before. This exhaustion arises because the soul has carried masks, obligations, and imposed dreams for years, and now, upon awakening, it begins to release all that accumulated weight. Soul fatigue also stems from the emotional and existential overload that comes with seeing the world through different eyes. When you awaken, you can no longer ignore the injustices, lies, and deceptions you previously navigated without awareness. This new level of sensitivity opens the door to clearer perception, but also to a deep wound. What previously went unnoticed now hurts. And this intensity is so great that the soul needs to rest, retreat, and disconnect from that which no longer resonates with its truth. Carl Jung understood this state very well. Awakening is not a permanent celebration, but a crisis that demands a complete restructuring of your being. Spiritual fatigue appears because the soul is busy healing. It is processing old memories, childhood wounds, traumas hidden in the shadows. While the ego ran around seeking external validation, your inner self stored everything you avoided looking at. Now, suddenly, everything comes to the surface and manifests in the form of exhaustion. Your vital energy is directed inward, toward cleansing and integration, leaving little room for external enthusiasms. This tiredness doesn't mean defeat. It's a sign that your spirit is working in the invisible, reorganizing what you could no longer sustain. But from the outside, it feels like demotivation, like a sudden stop. This is where many abandon the path, believing something went wrong. However, the truth is different. This tiredness is a sign of transformation, the necessary rest that precedes rebirth. Just as the earth withers before it blossoms, your soul needs to go through this pause to give birth to new strength. I want to invite you to reflect. If right now you feel too tired, that life has lost its color, don't punish or blame yourself. You are in a process of deep cleansing. Soul tiredness isn't a sign that you're lost. It's proof that your spirit is freeing itself from everything that doesn't belong to it. Endure this moment, because after the fatigue will come a more authentic energy, a motivation that springs from the essence and not from illusions. Help us reach more people. Subscribe, give us a like, and tell us in the comments what spiritual signs you've experienced. One of the most painful shocks of spiritual awakening is discovering that material things no longer fulfill you as they once did. Suddenly, the objects, luxuries, external achievements, and even the small pleasures that used to motivate you lose their luster. It's as if everything that seemed indispensable to you now fades in the face of a greater truth. You may have money in your pocket, a new car, a comfortable house, or even a good job, but none of it manages to ignite the spark that once made you feel alive. And at that moment, the inevitable question arises: what is left for me if none of this makes me happy anymore? For years, the system has taught us that happiness lies in accumulation, accumulating objects, titles, experiences, and even relationships as if they were trophies. But when the soul awakens, it sees clearly that these trophies are ephemeral and that the emptiness cannot be filled with things. This revelation is devastating for the ego because everything that nourished it vanishes. Social recognition no longer carries weight. Status symbols seem absurd, and superficial desires feel hollow. External motivation, based on material things, collapses, leaving the person in a state of apparent apathy. Carl Jung pointed out that this disillusionment is inevitable because the soul seeks transcendence. When the psyche begins to connect with the profound, everything superficial loses its power. And this is a turning point. Many people, upon discovering it, feel they've lost their way. They believe life no longer has meaning because the motives that once drove them have disappeared. However, what's actually happening is that the spirit is redirecting its attention to another level of existence, beyond the tangible. The problem is that this change isn't experienced as immediate and clear. At first, all we perceive is emptiness. Emptiness in things, emptiness in goals, emptiness in achievements. This emptiness can be so overwhelming that it's even mistaken for depression, but the truth is that it's a transitional phase. The soul is learning to find meaning not in what we buy or what we show off, but in what we feel and what truly transforms. Motivation begins to shift from the outside in, although at first, the only visible thing is a great disinterest in material things. If today you find yourself looking at your possessions and feeling like none of them matter, don't interpret this as a failure. You are going through the necessary detachment for a more authentic motivation to emerge. The loss of meaning in material things isn't the end of the road. It's a sign that your spirit is ready to discover what transcends the ephemeral, the true purpose of your existence. After losing your sense of material life, one of the most intense and difficult stages of spiritual awakening emerges: the identity crisis. It's the moment when you begin to question who you really are, beyond your name, your profession, your role in society, or the labels others have placed on you. Everything that once defined you, your job, your family, your beliefs, even your passions, begins to feel strange, as if it no longer belongs to you. It's like looking into a mirror and not recognizing yourself, because the image it reflects no longer matches what vibrates within you. Carl Jung called this process individuation, a profound journey where the person must shed the masks imposed by the ego and the collective to begin to discover their unique essence. But this journey isn't easy. When everything that defined you crumbles, the first thing that appears is the feeling of emptiness and confusion. Who am I if I'm not what I studied? Who am I if I no longer identify with the beliefs I inherited? Who am I if what once fascinated me no longer excites me? These questions open up uncharted territory that's frightening, because there are no immediate answers. This identity crisis can be so strong that many feel they are dying in life. It's not the body that dies, but the personality they had built over years. That I that took so much effort crumbles in the face of the power of awakening. And although this process is painful, it is absolutely necessary. Because as long as you cling to an identity based on external expectations, you will not be able to hear the true calling of your soul. Awakening demands this surrender, the courage to let go of what you thought you were in order to discover who you truly are. The problem is that during this transition, the individual may feel directionless and purposeless. It's as if walking down a dark corridor where all the familiar doors have closed, but the new one has yet to open. This feeling of being in limbo is part of the process, an in-between space in which the old self no longer has power, but the new self has yet to reveal itself. This is where the soul begins to build a more authentic identity, not based on ego or external recognition, but on connection with the divine and the essential. I want you to know that if you're going through this identity crisis, you're not alone. Everyone who's awakened has felt that loss of ground, that seemingly endless confusion. But it's also true that after this storm comes clarity. The crisis isn't a mistake, it's the bridge to your authenticity. And even if you feel like you're nothing now, you're actually beginning to become who you always were in essence. When awakening splits you in two, the world around you seems to shrink. You discover that many conversations were disguises, that certain laughs were escape valves, and that bonds were sustained out of habit, not truth. Then isolation sets in. Not because you despise anyone, but because your nascent sensitivity can't tolerate falsehood. Family and friends look at you with concern. Why did you change? You used to be more fun. You're making your life more complicated. What they don't see is that your soul has begun to demand silence to hear its own voice. It's not escape. It's a necessary retreat to survive so much noise. Misunderstanding hurts because it touches the core of belonging. The group, the tribe, pressures you to revert to the mold. They want the old person, functional and predictable. They label you weird, distant, depressed, fanatic. But what you feel is something else. The old personality, that mask Jung called the persona, no longer serves you. You begin to prefer an afternoon of contemplation to a boisterous event, a book to a gossip column, an honest conversation to a parade of opinions. And that choice, although it isolates you, makes you coherent. Isolation isn't a spiritual punishment, it's a cleansing process. By distancing yourself, you distinguish between those who love you for what you appear to be and those who love you for who you are. You become more selective. You filter out environments, habits, and dynamics that erode your peace. It's not arrogance, it's the hygiene of the soul. You learn to say no without guilt, to sustain silence without anxiety, to honor your internal rhythms even when the social calendar doesn't understand. At night, when the world sleeps, you accept solitude as a stern teacher. It shows you your cracks, but it also gives you tools to repair them. To navigate this stage without breaking down, you need simple and courageous rituals. Define daily spaces of stillness, even if it's just 15 minutes of conscious breathing. Communicate clearly, without overly justifying yourself. your new boundaries. Seek a community of resonance, not to escape the world, but to remember that you're not crazy. Differentiate between isolation that sickens and retreat that heals. If you shut down out of fear, you shrink. If you retreat to integrate, you grow. And accept that some relationships will cool, not out of malice, but because your inner temperature has changed. Fidelity to your soul will always have a cost, but betraying yourself is more expensive. Over time, you will understand that this distance is a sacred desert. In it, the attachments that kept you small die, and an intimacy with the real is born that doesn't fit in parties or photos. The incomprehension of others loses its power when you live truly. You no longer need to convince anyone. Your solitude becomes fertile. Intuitions, clarity, and purpose germinate there. And when you return to the world, because you will do so lightly, without begging for acceptance. This isolation was your secret workshop. In the next stretch, the unconscious will begin to push back its resistance. Ancient shadows will come to reclaim their place, and you will be ready to face them from the front. Spiritual awakening not only opens the door to light, it also opens the floodgates to what the unconscious has kept hidden for years. In this phase, old fears, forgotten wounds, and memories you thought were buried forever emerge. Suddenly, childhood situations, past betrayals, unresolved guilt, or emotions you never dared to face appear with overwhelming force. This resistance from the unconscious doesn't come to punish you, but to show you what you still need to integrate. However, the immediate effect is devastating. Motivation disappears because the soul is preoccupied with facing internal work far more important than any external goal. The conscious mind often reacts with rejection. Why is this coming back now? I've already gotten over it. I don't need to remember any more pain. But Jung taught that repression doesn't disappear. It just waits in the shadows until it finds a chance to come out. And spiritual awakening is that perfect opportunity. When the light touches the soul, it also illuminates what was hidden in the darkest corners of the psyche. This confrontation is exhausting, consumes energy, and can lead to confusion, because your attention shifts from the outside world to inward, toward the unfinished business. This process saps motivation because the soul needs all its strength to heal. Suddenly, things that once seemed simple, working, socializing, even enjoying life, become titanic efforts. It's not laziness or lack of interest. It's your being waging an internal battle. The unconscious brings pains to the present that must be bravely faced, and on that invisible battlefield, there's no energy left for trivial goals. This is where many feel trapped, failing to understand that true spiritual progress occurs in that moment of apparent stagnation. The challenge is not to run away from the discomfort. When repressed memories surface, the tendency is to escape. Distract yourself with routines, hide behind work, seek out numbing addictions. But awakening invites you to do the opposite. Stop, face the pain, and listen. Every wound contains a message. Every fear hides a lesson. And although the process is slow, each healed memory returns a fragment of your vital energy, gradually freeing you from that invisible burden. I want to remind you of something essential. You are not losing your life, you are recovering your soul. This time of endurance is a secret workshop where your new identity is forged. You may feel unmotivated, tired, and trapped in a sea of emotions today, but trust that behind this storm, a rebirth is brewing. Allow yourself to heal at your own pace without comparing yourself to anyone. The darkness you face today is the same darkness that will become your strength tomorrow. If any of these signs resonate with you, please write in the comments, "I am healing." One of the most intense moments of spiritual awakening is the direct encounter with the shadow. Jung clearly stated that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making darkness conscious. And it is precisely at this point that we understand the magnitude of his words. The shadow is not an external monster or a divine punishment. It is the part of ourselves that we reject, that we hide because it doesn't fit with what society expected or what our ego wanted to portray. When that shadow appears, it does so brutally. with repressed emotions, behaviors we don't understand, and fears that seem uncontrollable. This process can feel like losing your way, because what emerges from the shadow contradicts the image we once believed of ourselves. Perhaps you always saw yourself as kind, but the shadow reveals your suppressed anger. Perhaps you considered yourself brave, and suddenly deep fears you never accepted emerge. What the shadow brings seems to dismantle your identity, and it's natural for demotivation to set in. How can I move forward if I don't like what I see in myself? But here's the key. It's not about denying, but about accepting and integrating those hidden parts, because only then can you rebuild yourself in fullness. Confronting the shadow hurts because it forces us to look at ourselves without filters. You discover that much of your life was an attempt to hide what you were ashamed of. The ego built a mask to survive, but in awakening, that mask breaks and what was repressed demands attention. It's uncomfortable, even frightening, but it's also liberating. Because every dark aspect you acknowledge becomes a source of power once integrated. Repressed anger is transformed into strength, denied vulnerability into compassion, hidden fear into wisdom. Many at this point believe they've lost their way, that awakening led them to confusion instead of clarity. The truth is, it's just the opposite. Before, you lived in illusions. Now you're facing the truth about yourself. Same. Integrating the shadow is the beginning of an authentic reconstruction, where you don't need to pretend to fit in or hide to be accepted. It means becoming whole again, recognizing that within you there is both light and darkness, and that both are part of your essence. I want you to remember this. Looking at your shadow doesn't mean you're bad, broken, or unworthy. It means you're human and willing to evolve. Every step in this process is an act of courage. The motivation that seems dead today will be reborn stronger, because it will no longer depend on masks, but on your integrated truth. The shadow is not the end of your journey, it's the door to your authentic awakening. Spiritual awakening not only moves your thoughts and emotions, it also inevitably shakes your external reality. At this stage, relationships that seemed solid begin to fracture, jobs you thought were stable lose meaning, and habits that had accompanied your life for years suddenly break down. This process doesn't occur because you seek to destroy your life, but because the soul, by raising its frequency, no longer tolerates anything that doesn't vibrate coherently. What once seemed comfortable now feels suffocating, and what was once lived as routine now weighs like a chain. This forced detachment is perceived as a painful loss. People with whom you shared your daily life begin to drift away, some because they no longer understand your new path, and others because they're simply completing their cycle. The same thing happens with jobs or projects. Suddenly, the passion disappears, and what once motivated you loses its value. At that moment, demotivation sets in, because you feel like everything you built is crumbling before you. It's like watching a garden with all its flowers cut off, leaving it empty and colorless. Carl Jung spoke of this process as an essential part of transformation. The psyche cannot be reborn without first pruning. Just as a farmer cuts branches so the tree can grow stronger, the soul eliminates ties, environments, and habits that prevent it from expanding. But at the time, this act of cleansing is not understood as a blessing, but as a punishment. You ask yourself, why am I losing so much? Why does everything fall apart just when I'm trying to get closer to the truth? The truth needs space to manifest, and it only appears when the old has left. This detachment is also a test of trust. The ego screams that you're losing everything, that without those people, jobs, or routines, you won't be able to move forward. But the soul knows this is a transition to something greater. The lack of motivation you feel in this phase is the natural mourning for what's gone. It's not weakness, it's humanity. You need to acknowledge the pain of loss, but also open yourself to the hope that this pruning will allow what's authentic to flourish in your life. I want you to look at this forced detachment from a different perspective. Every loss is also a liberation. What feels like emptiness today will become fruitful tomorrow. That space that hurts now is the ground where new motivations, new connections, and a higher purpose will grow. Don't cling to what has already run its course. Trust that your soul knows what it needs to let go of so that your true self can flourish fully. Spiritual awakening reaches its most painful point in what mystics have called the dark night of the soul. It's that period in which the emptiness becomes unbearable, apathy takes over your days, and the loss of energy seems total. It's no longer simply that you've lost interest in material or social matters. It's as if life itself has lost meaning. You wake up listlessly, you walk listlessly, and even the simplest thing, like smiling or speaking, becomes a titanic effort. At this point, many believe the awakening was a mistake because the pain is so intense that it seems to have no purpose. What you must understand is that this dark night is not a punishment, but a rebirth in disguise. It is the crucible where your soul is being forged. The old motivation, the one that came from the ego, has already died, and the new inner strength has not yet been born. This intermediate space is a desert, but it is also a spiritual womb. In the apparent darkness, something new is gestating. Like a seed that needs to die in the earth to sprout, your soul goes through this process of internal decomposition so that the true self can emerge. Carl Jung pointed out that confronting the unconscious and the shadow produces this feeling of total emptiness. It's as if the old self had disappeared and the new one hadn't yet appeared. Here the ego no longer has power, and that generates panic. However, in this deep silence, in this uncomfortable darkness, is where an authentic motivation begins to emerge, different from everything you knew. A motivation that doesn't depend on external goals, but on a connection with the eternal that dwells within you. Interior. At this point, many abandon the path because they mistake darkness for the end. But those who endure discover something extraordinary. By accepting the emptiness, it begins to transform into fullness. The dark night becomes a teacher, showing you that you don't need trappings or illusions to exist. You are enough, even if you have nothing external to confirm it. This truth is harsh, but it is liberating. The motivation that emerges afterward will be pure, genuine, impossible to corrupt, because it will be born from the very core of your being. If you're going through this tunnel today, don't think you're lost. You're in the secret workshop of your soul. Be patient with yourself, because the dark night is the bridge to clarity. When the storm ends, you'll discover you have more strength than you imagine, and that what seemed like death was, in fact, birth. Share this video so more people understand they are not alone in this process. After passing through the deepest darkness, the soul begins to experience a resurgence that, although slow, feels profoundly real. It's like seeing the first light of dawn after a long night. The motivation that had died along with the ego begins to be reborn from a completely different place. It's no longer about chasing external goals, pleasing others, or accumulating titles or recognition. A gentle but powerful force emerges that compels you to live with purpose, to serve from the heart, and to connect with the divine in your everyday life. That is true spiritual motivation. This rebirth doesn't happen all at once. At first, it comes in small flashes. A moment of peace amidst silence, a sincere emotion when helping someone, a feeling of gratitude when contemplating the simple. Little by little, these flashes become more frequent until they become the new foundation of your life. What once motivated you, applause, validation, comparison, no longer matters. Now, what truly drives you is feeling aligned with your essence and the greater plan of your existence. Authentic motivation comes from the spirit, not the ego. Carl Jung explained that individuation, this process of deep integration, allows human beings to discover their inner purpose. And this is where that purpose becomes evident. You are not in this world to chase shadows, but to expand your consciousness, grow in love, and contribute to the collective awakening. This certainty brings with it renewed energy. It's not a superficial enthusiasm that rises and falls with circumstances, but a motivating calm that accompanies you in everything you do. You know that even the smallest things have meaning when they're connected to the divine. The new motivation doesn't seek applause either. On the contrary, it becomes intimate and silent. You don't need to shout out your achievements or showcase your life to be validated. the spiritual fulfillment you experience is reward enough. This doesn't mean you're abandoning the world, but rather that you now inhabit it from a different place. You work, create, share, and connect not out of a need for recognition, but for the joy of being aligned with your purpose. Motivation is no longer a race, but a natural flow that sustains you day after day. If at any point you felt your motivation had died, understand that this grieving process was necessary to get here, because only by losing what is false can you find what is true. The rebirth of authentic motivation is a reminder that your life has a higher meaning: to serve, to love, and to expand your consciousness. This motivation never runs out because it doesn't depend on external factors. It is born from the soul and therefore is eternal. As we reach the end of this journey, it's crucial to remember the great lesson. The loss of motivation that accompanies spiritual awakening isn't the end, but the beginning of a deeper path. What seemed like a collapse was, in reality, a rebirth. The emptiness, apathy, and exhaustion weren't punishments, but the purification needed to strip away the false and make room for the true. Each stage, from the collision with the hidden truth to the dark night of the soul, was part of a rebuilding process meant to take you to a higher level of consciousness and fulfillment. Carl Jung expressed it clearly. Awakening does not mean denying the shadow or clinging only to the light. True awakening is integrating the totality of one's being, accepting both light and darkness, and learning to walk in balance with both. This integration is what gives you back authentic motivation, which does not seek external recognition, but rather internal coherence. Understanding this transforms the way you see your life. What once seemed like an obstacle now becomes a stepping stone. What once seemed like a loss now reveals itself as a gain spiritual. This closure is also a reminder of hope. Because even if you felt the deepest discouragement, even if you experienced loneliness, misunderstanding, or emptiness, none of it was in vain. It was all part of an awakening process larger than yourself, a process your soul chose to align you with a higher purpose. What seemed like death was actually sowing. What seemed like darkness was actually preparation. You are more alive, more aware, and closer to your essence than ever before. And now, when you look back, you'll see that it all made sense. The lack of motivation was the fire that burned away the illusory. The emptiness was the ground where your authenticity germinated, and the dark night was the threshold to your true strength. Today, you can understand that you didn't lose motivation. You changed fuel. You no longer live for the ego, you live for the soul, and that difference marks the beginning of a completely new life, guided by purpose, love, and connection with the divine. If you've made it this far, write in the comments, "I'm ready for my true spiritual motivation." Subscribe and share this message with those seeking answers.